Everyone called the Sherman a bad tank until the day German engineers opened one and realized they hadn't been losing to its armor or its gun, but to something far more embarrassing. Inside that wreck, they found a flaw so simple, so backwards, that it made this weak tank return to the battlefield again and again, no matter how many times they destroyed it. And in that moment, they understood why their best machines kept dying, while this one refused to stay dead. The wrecked Sherman hit the concrete with a heavy, final thud. No ceremony, no hesitation. Just a dead machine dumped in front of the people who needed answers. Hans Meyer stepped forward before the dust even settled. "Cut it open," he said. No speech, no discussion, just an order. The engineers around him sparked their torches to life, blue flames snapping in the cold air. They had dissected German machines countless times. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, but this was different. This wasn't pride. This was annoyance, mixed with something darker, confusion. Because no matter how many times the frontline units reported Sherman destroyed, another one always showed up to replace it. Same shape, same silhouette, same, supposedly, bad tank. And that was the part no one could explain. A torch bit into the hull. The first line of glowing metal stretched across the Sherman's side. Hans watched closely, not for beauty or elegance, but for intent. When the panel dropped, everyone leaned in. No precision finish, no refined joints, no intricate, hand-fitted parts, just thick cast metal, a layout that ignored aesthetics entirely, and components arranged with a kind of brutal simplicity. One engineer scoffed. "This looks like factory scrap." Hans shook his head once. "Scrap doesn't behave like this did." He pointed to the interior supports, straight lines, simple curves, parts you could teach any worker to make without years of training. No tight tolerances, no delicate machining. Every piece looked like it had been designed to survive mistakes. Another plate came off, more of the same, direct, functional, unapologetic. Hans didn't blink. He had seen enough complex engineering to know when something was carefully crafted and when something was intentionally made to avoid ever needing careful craft. "What are we looking at?" one of the engineers asked. Hans didn't answer. Not yet. He wasn't ready to speak, the thought forming in his mind, a thought none of them wanted to admit. Because this wasn't incompetence, and it wasn't laziness. It was strategy. A third panel fell away, clanging onto the floor. Every layer they removed exposed the same message, clearer and louder. This machine wasn't built to impress engineers. It wasn't built to win design awards. It wasn't built to be admired at all. It was built for something far more dangerous. Hans took a step back, eyes narrowing at the open cross-section of the Sherman. "Keep cutting," he said. He needed to see everything before he said what he already suspected. Long before Hans sliced open the Sherman in that cold test hall, the problem had already revealed itself loud and clear on the fields of Normandy. Lieutenant Eric Bauer didn't need an engineer to explain anything to him. He had seen it with his own eyes. On a damp June morning, his Panther sat buried behind a hedgerow, engine idling low, gun locked forward. The hedges around him were tall enough to swallow a tank whole, creating natural ambush corridors that every German commander prayed for. And then he heard it. Engines. Multiple. Not the deep growl of a tiger. Not the harsh roar of a panther. Something lighter. Faster. Closer. Eric raised his binoculars. 3 Shermans rolled into view, single file, moving down a narrow French lane. They weren't hiding. They weren't maneuvering cleverly. They were just coming. "Shermans." 3, Eric said calmly. His gunner laughed under his breath. "They never learn." Eric didn't answer. He didn't like underestimating anything, not even these boxy silhouettes creeping between the hedges. But this was the opportunity every Panther crew wanted. Perfect position, perfect angle, perfect shot. "Target the lead tank," Eric ordered. The Panther's long 75 barked once. The first Sherman vanished in a plume of flame. The second panicked, trying to reverse out of the kill zone. The third lurched sideways, tracks grinding against the hedgerow like it was trying to escape by instinct alone. "Next," Eric said. Another shot. Another Sherman stopped moving. The lane filled with smoke. The air stank of burnt rubber and cordite. 2 kills in seconds, exactly what German doctrine promised. And yet, as Eric scanned the horizon through the thinning smoke, he felt something tighten in his chest. More engines. Not 3, not 5, many. Another column of Shermans emerged behind the first, pushing forward as if the losses meant nothing. Their spacing was tight, their formation crude, but they kept advancing with a kind of stubborn momentum that made no tactical sense. Eric's gunner muttered, "Where are they getting all these?" Erich didn't reply. He didn't know. They destroyed another, then another, but for every one they knocked out, 2 more seemed to replace it. The battlefield didn't empty. It thickened. By afternoon, Eric's Panther had scored 7 confirmed kills, and his crew was exhausted not from the fighting, but from the realization that the fighting wouldn't stop. Near dusk, as his tank finally pulled back to resupply, Eric said something he had never admitted before. "We can win every duel," he muttered, "but we can't win a war fought like this." He didn't mean courage. He didn't mean tactics. He meant something else entirely, something Germany had never prepared for. A tank you could destroy, and destroy, and destroy, and it still wasn't gone. That night, as Eric wrote his combat report, he paused at a line he didn't know how to phrase. In the end, he wrote the only thing he could. "We are not outgunned. We are outnumbered by something that should not be able to outnumber us." He shut the logbook, but the thought stayed with him, long after the fighting moved inland. If the Sherman was truly as weak as everyone said, why did killing them change nothing? Months later, that question would land squarely in Hans Meyer's test hall, forcing him to confront the same truth Eric had glimpsed through the smoke. And Hans wasn't going to like the answer. By the second hour of cutting, the Sherman was no longer a tank. It was a diagram opened, exposed, undeniable. Hans Meyer stood over it like a man staring at a puzzle that shouldn't exist. Every time a new section of armor dropped to the floor, the same message repeated itself in shapes of steel. This machine wasn't built the way Germany built tanks, and it wasn't meant to be. The younger engineers around him didn't see it yet. They were still fixated on individual flaws. "Look at this weld," one said, pointing. "Uneven. Bracket spacing is sloppy," another added. Hans didn't bother correcting them. Sloppiness was an accident. This was design. He tapped the exposed inner wall. "Notice the casting," one of the engineers frowned. "Casting? On a tank this size? Why?" Hans answered without looking up. "Because one giant casting replaces dozens of smaller pieces, fewer cuts, fewer welds, fewer machining steps." He paused, letting the thought sink in. "Fewer hours," he added. The room went quiet. Not because anyone disagreed, because they understood exactly what that meant. A Panther needed skilled welders, precision-fit plates, and machine shops that had to be calibrated perfectly. Every step relied on craftsmen, not workers. Every mistake cost time Germany didn't have. The Sherman, on the other hand, Hans ran his hand across a cast section, the surface rough to the touch. "This isn't meant for perfection," he said. "It's meant to be repeated." Another panel fell away, revealing the driver's station. Hans immediately crouched. The layout was almost insulting in its simplicity. Straight levers, wide pedals, nothing hidden behind armored boxes or complex linkages. An engineer sneered. "Looks primitive." Hans shook his head. "It looks maintainable." He pointed at the control lines, clean routing, gentle curves, everything reachable without disassembling half the vehicle. "You could train a civilian to drive this in a week," he said. 2, if he's clumsy. A few men chuckled, but Hans didn't. Germans trained tank crews like specialists. Months of instruction, hours learning the quirks of machines built with tight tolerances and fragile precision. Losing a trained Panther crewman was losing a valuable asset. The Americans? Their machines didn't require valuable assets. They required bodies. He moved to the turret ring next. The access ports were wide. The ring gear was exposed enough to service without contortions. Hans exhaled slowly. They built this, assuming whoever repairs it will be tired, cold, under fire. and probably inexperienced. One engineer finally said what they were all thinking. But why would anyone design a tank this way? Hans stood, brushing metal dust from his coat. Because they don't need one perfect crew with one perfect machine, he said. They need thousands of crews with tanks that work well enough, even when everything else is going wrong. That was the beginning of it. Not a single part, not a single choice. A pattern. A pattern Germany had never followed, not even once. Germany built masterpieces. America built tools. And Hans was beginning to understand which approach survived a long war. He stepped back from the gutted vehicle, eyes narrowing. "We're not looking at engineering flaws," he said quietly. "We're looking at priorities." It was the first time anyone in the room felt a chill, colder than the winter air. Because priorities were not something you fixed with better welding or better steel. Priorities came from an entire nation, and changing that was impossible. The moment the rear plate finally dropped, the smell hit them: first burnt oil, scorched rubber, and the faint sweetness of fuel residue. The Sherman's engine bay opened like a steel coffin, exposing a mass of pipes, mounts, and the battered remains of an aircraft-derived radial engine. One of the younger engineers scoffed. "A radial? In a tank? Ridiculous." Hans didn't answer. Not immediately. Ridiculous was a strong word. Ridiculous was also what Germany used to call American industrial output, right up until they drowned in it. He leaned in, eyes narrowing at the mounting system. Not elegant, not efficient, not even close to the compact engineering of a Panther's engine compartment. But what this lacked in elegance, it returned tenfold in something far more dangerous. "Look at the cradle," Hans said. The men gathered closer. The entire engine assembly, radial block, transmission interface, mounts sat inside a simple, heavy frame bolted to the hull at obvious, accessible points. 4 bolts here, 2 braces there. Each one reachable without having to move a dozen other parts first. "This whole unit can be removed," Hans said. "In a workshop?" an engineer asked. Hans shook his head. "No. In a field. With a crane. Maybe even with a few timber beams if you're desperate." The idea sat wrong with them. German engines were buried inside their tanks like organs inside a rib cage. To remove one, you had to disassemble layers of precision-fitted systems, coolant lines, gear housings, alignment fixtures, electrical routing, hours of work, sometimes days. Here, Hans tapped the cradle. "Loosen the bolts, lift it out, drop a new one in." Done. A long silence followed. Another engineer tried to salvage pride. "But this engine is crude, loud, inefficient." Hans nodded. "Yes." He grabbed a hose clamp, ripped it loose, and held it up. "And this clamp," he said, "is the same as the ones used near the driver's station. Same tool, same size." He pointed deeper into the bay. "Those bolts? Same type we saw on the turret access point." It clicked, not slowly, violently. The Americans weren't simplifying because they lacked skill. They were simplifying because they intended to build tens of thousands of these machines, and they intended for every one of them to be repaired by someone who might have never touched a tank before the war. A mechanic trained last month could replace these parts. A farmhand drafted last week could tighten these bolts. Hans didn't smile, but he understood. "This isn't engineering for performance," he said. "It's engineering for momentum." He stepped back from the engine bay, letting the others absorb it. A Panther's engine was a masterpiece, tight, refined, tuned to perfection. A Sherman's engine was a hammer, loud, ugly, impossible to ignore, and absolutely unstoppable once it started working. "What good is a masterpiece," Hans said quietly, "if it can't be replaced before the next battle?" No one answered. He wiped soot from his hands, then pointed at the open hull. "This design assumes failure," he said, "and then it assumes recovery." The room stayed silent, but the implications were deafening. The Sherman did not need to survive. It only needed to return, and return, and return again. Germany never built anything with that philosophy in mind, and Hans knew, with a tightening in his chest, that this wasn't a matter of skill or intelligence. It was a matter of mindset, a national one, something a torch and a blueprint could never fix. By late afternoon, the Sherman looked less like a tank and more like an open toolbox. Parts were catalogued in piles across the floor. Panels lay stacked like discarded armor plates from ancient battles. The engineers had moved from shock to certainty. Every corner they opened revealed the same theme: simplicity, accessibility, speed. But Hans still felt something missing. Machines could explain how the Sherman survived, but not why it behaved like a machine that refused to stay dead. Not why crews could run it, fix it, and send it back into battle faster than German doctrine believed possible. That answer came from a place no one expected. A junior engineer called out, "There's something wedged behind this rack." Hans turned. The man pried open a narrow compartment near the radio mount. Out slid a flat, oil-stained bundle, wrapped in brittle plastic. Paper. A manual. Not a blueprint. Not a technical document for factories. This was clearly made for the men who drove the tank. Hans wiped grime from the cover, revealing smudged American lettering. He couldn't read it, but he recognized the layout. Step-by-step diagrams, bold warning icons, troubleshooting charts. He called to Friedrich, one of the few engineers who had spent time in the United States before the war. "Translate." Friedrich scanned a page. His brow furrowed. "This isn't a manual," he said quietly. "It's a conversation." Hans took the book from him. The pages weren't written in technical jargon. They weren't filled with theory or complex schematics. Every instruction was direct, blunt, and shockingly simple. "If you hear this noise, do this. If that doesn't fix the problem, try this next. Check here before calling for support. You can complete this repair with 2 men." Hans turned another page. A diagram showed a loader how to clear a jam using only leverage and 1 spare tool. Another page showed the driver how to adjust track tension using nothing but a wrench and a block of wood. One engineer snorted. "Do they think their crews are idiots?" Hans didn't even look up. "No," he said. "They think their crews are busy." The room went still again. He flipped more pages. Field fixes, emergency procedures, shortcuts, all designed for men with limited time, limited training, and limited mental bandwidth under fire. He tapped the book sharply. "This," he said, "is the reason their tanks come back." The others stared at him. "We rely on specialists, crews trained for months, mechanics trained for years. Lose one, and we lose capability." He raised the manual. "They designed these tanks for men who do not have that luxury. Drafted men, farmers, mechanics, boys who learned to drive a tractor last summer." Another engineer frowned. "But why make a tank so simple that anyone can repair it?" Hans closed the manual. "So that anyone will." He walked around the gutted Sherman, manual in hand, as if seeing the machine for the first time. The engine cradle, the standardized bolts, the casting, the layout, none of it works without this. He held up the book. "This isn't just instructions. This is philosophy. They aren't designing a tank. They're designing a workforce." The truth hit the room harder than any shell impact. German tanks needed perfect crews in perfect conditions with perfect supply. The Sherman needed none of that. It needed only this: a man willing to get his hands dirty, a wrench that fit half the vehicle, and a set of instructions written for real humans, not ideal ones. Hans set the manual on the tank's open hull, its pages fluttering in the cold air. "This," he said quietly, "is the part we can't copy." And every man standing there knew he was right. 2 days later, Hans Meyer stood in a drafty administrative hall, miles from the test grounds. A long table cut the room in half. On one side sat officers in crisp uniforms, their collars marked with tank badges and staff insignia. On the other side stood Hans and his engineers, oil-stained, exhausted, and carrying rolled sketches under their arms. A colonel tapped his pen impatiently. "Well, Engineer Meyer, you've opened their tank. Tell us what makes it so persistent." Persistent. A polite word for, why does this thing keep coming back to haunt us? Hans unrolled the first sheet cross-sections of the Sherman, annotated in clean lines of pencil and ink. He kept his voice level. "The armor is unremarkable. Cast, moderately thick, strong enough in some places, weak in others." One officer scoffed. "We already knew that." Hans nodded. "Yes, but that isn't the point." He unrolled the next diagram, the internal layout. "The components are simple, very simple. Everything is placed where hands can reach it quickly. Nothing is hidden. Nothing requires special tools. The colonel frowned. Why is that relevant? Hans didn't hesitate. Because it means they can repair and replace parts faster than we can write repair orders. The room shifted. Several officers exchanged glances, not liking the direction but unable to argue with the evidence. Hans moved to the engine assembly drawing. Their engine is not efficient. It is not elegant. But it sits on a cradle that can be removed as a single unit. In the field, with minimal tools. A staff officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Are you telling me their crews can swap an engine without a workshop? Yes, Hans said flatly. And faster than we can get a damaged Panther to one. The room stiffened. Another officer tried a different angle. Fine. But the gun? Inferior. They admit that themselves, Hans nodded. In isolation, yes. But gun performance is irrelevant if your tank is operational longer than the enemy's. He let the silence hang. Then he opened the manual. The simple, field-worn, oil-stained booklet. This, Hans said, is the true weapon. Murmurs spread across the room. He flipped it open. Step-by-step repairs. Workarounds. Troubleshooting written clearly enough for a conscript to follow under fire. They designed their tank so that an inexperienced crew can keep it alive. One officer bristled. Are you praising them, Meyer? No, Hans said sharply. I am describing us. The room fell dead quiet. Hans closed the manual with a snap. We built machines that require perfect conditions, perfect logistics, perfect crews. And when any one of those pieces breaks, the entire system collapses. He placed the Sherman diagram beside a Panther diagram. They built machines that assume things will break and built a system that recovers faster than the machine fails. A general finally spoke. His voice was low. Then what you're telling us is, we cannot outlast them. Hans hesitated only a moment. In a duel, Panther against Sherman, we win. He let that fact sit because it was true. But this war is not a duel, he continued. This war is repetition, replacement, momentum. And in that, they win every time. No one interrupted. Hans gathered his papers, his hands steady but his jaw tight. You asked why the Sherman keeps returning, he said. It is because it was built to return. That was the intention from the start. He paused at the doorway, turning back for one final line. We built masterpieces. They built continuity, and continuity is beating us. He left them with that, a sentence heavier than steel. The officers could argue with Hans. They could dismiss his tone, question his judgment, accuse him of exaggeration, but the front lines couldn't. The front lines spoke in torn steel, burnt fuel, and reports written by men who didn't have the luxury of theory. A week after the briefing, a courier arrived at the test facility. He carried a stack of documents, combat reports, maintenance logs, and a sealed envelope addressed to Hans Meyer. The envelope was smudged with dirt and ash, as if it had traveled through the war itself. Hans opened it first. Inside was a damage report from a Panther unit operating west of Caen. The handwriting was tight, hurried, written by someone with no time to waste. Engaged enemy Shermans, destroyed 4, knocked out 2, forced to withdraw when fuel ran low and the next wave arrived. Hans read the line twice. It wasn't the kills that mattered. It was the sentence after them. The next wave arrived. That was the part Germany could not counter with engineering brilliance. He flipped to another report. This one described a battle near St. Lo. A company of Panthers ambushed a column of Shermans, inflicted heavy losses, then found themselves surrounded 30 minutes later by reinforcements that shouldn't have been there yet, reinforcements that had simply arrived. Then another file. A Tiger commander wrote, We destroyed 6 Shermans in the orchard. 5 replacements appeared before we could reposition. Hans didn't need to read between the lines. The lines were loud enough. Destroying Shermans wasn't the issue. Replacing them was. He laid the reports out across a workbench, aligning them side by side. Patterns emerged, patterns eerily identical to the ones he'd seen inside the tank itself. Simple systems, fast recovery, momentum, not perfection. A mechanic's log caught his attention. It mentioned a disabled Sherman recovered and repaired in less than 6 hours, using only field tools and parts salvaged from 2 others. In the margin, the German officer had scribbled, "Impossible for our vehicles." Hans exhaled slowly. Not in frustration, in recognition. Everything he saw on the battlefield side matched everything he'd seen inside the Sherman's hull. America wasn't winning because their tanks were good. They were winning because their tanks were present, always returning, always replaced. A tank didn't need to outfight a Panther. It only needed to outlive the logistics behind a Panther. Hans gathered the papers into a single stack. He looked at the Sherman still gutted on the test hall floor. Still crude, still ugly, still undeniably effective in the way only inevitability can be. The engineers around him were silent. They, too, understood now. The battlefield was confirming what the steel had already confessed. Germany wasn't losing to a superior tank. Germany was losing to a superior system, one designed to survive, defeat, and keep moving anyway. And no amount of precision machining could solve that. The Panther was still warm when Hans arrived. It lay half sunk in the mud at the edge of a hedgerow, turret frozen mid-rotation, armor pitted with impacts. Not destroyed, just exhausted, like the men who had fought inside it. A recovery crew stood nearby, waiting to hear whether the vehicle was worth dragging back. Hans didn't answer immediately. He circled the Panther first, tracing the long, precise welds with his fingertips. Beautiful work. Flawless engineering. But none of that mattered, because beauty didn't push a machine back into battle. Simplicity did. A truck rumbled up the road. An officer jumped down from the back, limping slightly. Uniform stained, eyes sharp from too little sleep. "Engineer Meyer?" he asked. "Yes, I'm Lieutenant Bauer." Hans knew the name. He had read Bauer's reports, the ones filled with Sherman kills, and the same chilling refrain. More were always coming. Bauer walked straight to the crippled Panther and slapped the armor with a hollow thud. "Beautiful machine," he said. Hans nodded. "It is, until it stops." Bauer's tone wasn't bitter. It was tired. They stood beside the wounded tank for a moment, sharing the silence of 2 men who understood engineering from different sides of a battlefield. Bauer broke the quiet first. "Rumor says you opened one of their Shermans. Found something interesting." Hans didn't bother denying it. "We did." "So?" Bauer asked. "What's their secret? Some special steel? New alloy? Hidden compartment full of miracles?" Hans shook his head. "Nothing like that." Bauer waited. Hans spoke plainly. "It's not strong. It's not advanced. The armor is ordinary. The gun is adequate. The engine is loud and inefficient." Bauer frowned. "Then why does it keep coming?" Hans turned toward the horizon, the direction from which Shermans always returned. "Because it was built for the war we are actually fighting," he said. "Not the one our designers imagined." Bauer's jaw tightened. "Meaning?" Hans tapped the Panther's flank. "This machine," he said, "was built for the best crews, the best fuel, the best maintenance, the best conditions. It performs beautifully when everything else does too." He pointed to where a faint column of smoke rose in the distance. The Sherman was built for the opposite. Bauer stared at him. For shortages, for mud, for crews trained last month, for mechanics without the right tools, for chaos. Hans finished the thought. For reality. Bauer didn't speak for a long time. The wind moved through the hedges, rattling branches against the Panther's hull. Finally he exhaled. "So we never really had a chance." Hans looked at the Panther, majestic, precise, helpless. "In a duel," he said, "we had every chance." He paused. "But the war isn't a duel." The 2 men stood quietly beside the machine that symbolized everything Germany had done right and everything it had done wrong. For the first time, Bauer understood what Hans had been forced to admit days earlier. Germany wasn't losing to a better tank. Germany was losing to a tank that did not need to be better. Germany didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled, bit by bit, machine by machine, factory by factory, until even the proudest engineers could see the truth they'd ignored. When the war finally ended, Hans Meyer found himself walking through a familiar place, made unfamiliar. A former German factory, once buzzing with precision machining, now silent except for the clatter of reconstruction crews. The smell of coolant and hot steel had been replaced by dust and fresh lumber. Machines were being reinstalled. New lines were being drawn. The nation was starting over. An American advisor spotted Hans lingering near a row of workshop benches. "You worked in one of these before the war?" the advisor asked. "Yes," Hans replied. "I built engines, gear housings, sometimes armored components." The advisor nodded thoughtfully. "Your people made impressive machines. Very impressive." Hans didn't smile. Praise wasn't what he came here for. The advisor continued. "We studied a lot of your designs, your armor angling, your high-velocity guns, even some of your optics." Hans looked around at the cleaned floors, the reorganized workstations, the posters of American-style production processes hung along the walls. "And we," he said quietly, "studied your Sherman." That made the advisor chuckle. "Ah, the ugly one." Hans exhaled. "Ugly is the wrong word. Honest would be better." He walked over to a newly installed assembly jig, simple, sturdy, designed for rapid part swaps. It reminded him of the Sherman's engine cradle. "The first time I climbed inside one," Hans said, "I didn't understand it. It felt crude. But it wasn't crude. It was intentional. Every shortcut was a plan. Every rough edge saved time. Every casting replaced a dozen welds." The advisor nodded. "We didn't have time for art." Hans tapped the jig. "No, you had time for war." He thought of the Panther he had inspected after meeting Lieutenant Bauer. A masterpiece stranded in the mud, waiting for fuel, waiting for repairs, waiting for conditions that no longer existed. "Our flaw," Hans said, "was that we kept designing for perfection even when the world was collapsing." The advisor folded his arms. "A perfect machine is only perfect until it stops. Then it's just heavy." Hans gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yes, and ours stopped often." He paused, remembering the moment the Sherman's manual fell open in his hands, the moment everything about the war suddenly made sense. "That tank," Hans said, "was the first one I ever saw that understood it would be used by exhausted men. In rain, in mud, with half their tools missing. It was designed for human beings, not for a drawing board." The advisor didn't argue. He didn't need to. Hans looked out through the factory windows, where cranes and trucks moved like pieces on a reconstruction board. "The Sherman wasn't superior," Hans said slowly. "It was possible, repeatable, buildable, faster than we could destroy it." He let the words settle, the final verdict forming in his mind. "We tried to win with brilliance. They won with continuity." Hans turned back to the empty factory floor. "And continuity," he whispered, "is the one weapon you cannot outfight." Years later, long after the wrecks had rusted into the soil and the factories had changed hands, a dusty archive box landed on a table in front of a junior historian. Inside it lay a bundle of reports, oil-stained sketches, field notes, and a single typed conclusion signed by Hans Meyer. The historian expected drawings of armor layouts, penetration charts, gun angles. Instead, he found something more unsettling. A quiet explanation of why a machine often mocked in hindsight had shaped the outcome of an entire war. Hans hadn't written about superiority. He had written about survival. The Sherman wasn't admired. It endured. It endured mud. It endured weather. It endured inexperienced crews, rushed repairs, missing tools, broken supply lines. And when it didn't endure, when it broke, burned, or vanished in smoke, another stood behind it, identical enough that the war never paused to notice the difference. Hans had put it in plain terms: a tank does not win because it is perfect. A tank wins because it is present. The historian read the line twice. Across the ocean, men argued endlessly about whether the Panther or the Tiger was the better tank, better armor, better gun, better optics. Hans never denied any of that. He'd admired his country's machines more than anyone. But he had seen what the battlefield actually demanded. No duel decided the war. No single tank decided the war. The war was decided by the one machine that could be built fast, fixed fast, and replaced faster than its destruction mattered. Hans had watched Germany design masterpieces and then crumble when masterpieces proved too slow, too delicate, too expensive to keep alive in a world collapsing faster than any blueprint could be drawn. In his final assessment, Hans wrote, "They designed a tank with the assumption that failure is constant and time is limited. We designed tanks assuming neither should happen." It wasn't a criticism. It was an autopsy of a machine, of a doctrine, of a mindset. The last page of Hans's report described the moment he understood everything. The open Sherman hull on the test hall floor, the rough brackets, the oversized castings, the simple tools, the manual written for men who didn't have the luxury of expertise. He summed it up in one sentence. The Sherman was not invincible. It was repeatable. The historian closed the folder slowly. Outside, modern tanks rumbled across training grounds, sleek, powerful, precise. But Hans's old truth still lingered, sharp as ever. In any long war, brilliance is impressive, but repeatability decides who still has machines left at the end. That was the secret the Germans discovered too late. A secret hidden not in armor or firepower, but in the simple, stubborn idea that a tank is only as strong as the system that keeps replacing it.